From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Well, welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. Today, we're going to take on a very, very important subject. You know, we talk about how out of the crucible of change, a new Montana was born. And part of that rebirth of Montana was in modernizing the government. And today we're going to focus in on the executive branch of Montana state government, a very massive, important process that was undertaken in the late 1960s and early 1970s to reorganize the executive branch of government and make it really functional on behalf of the people. The government is, the executive branch reorganization was important because that is how services were delivered to the people of Montana. And in fact, the nature of the disorganized state government prior to the reorganization effort led to control by massive numbers of bureaucrats, special interest groups, and constituent groups held sway over their little fiefdoms. And a governor, though elected by the people of Montana, really couldn't control the government on behalf of the people. So it was in that context that executive reorganization took place. And today we have a wonderful panel of experts from back in the day. And I want to introduce them just quickly first, and then we'll come back to them for detail later, is Tom Harrison. Tom is the former Majority Leader of the House, former state senator. He is a member of the Executive Reorganization Commission, and he's going to be able to give us the perspective of commissioners. In addition, Diana Dowling was an attorney with the commission and has had a distinguished career in state government and elsewhere since that time, as has Sheena Wilson, who cut her teeth in state government back at the reorganization level and was a researcher for the commission. So these folks represent what the real work that got done to lead to this executive reorganization. Now I want to start, and I'm just going to chat with you guys. We'll carry this on as like a conversation here, because that's what it is. But what we found and what existed was that there was a state government started out obviously 1889 with very few departments. And it wasn't hard to manage it, but as you would know, as time went on, more and more departments and commissions were created, and it grew over time. And so that over the first 8 decades that we were a state, there were 6 different reorganization studies conducted and recommendations made to the legislature, out of which came almost nothing. Very little reorganization occurred. A few things here or there, but not a lot. Minor changes. So the real challenge here, and we have this right up here represents the real challenge, was basically almost 200 boards, bureaus, and commissions that governors and other people appointed, and no one controlled them. A governor could be a governor for 6 or 7 years, and he wouldn't even control the board, let alone the fact that if you controlled the boards and they listened to you, how do you manage with all these bodies making decisions? So that is the chaotic state of state government that existed. And it didn't matter if you were a Democrat or Republican governor. It didn't matter what party you were, you couldn't effectively run government. And so really the people of Montana understood the need for this kind of change. But those that were vested in the existing structure didn't want change and had effectively stopped it for all those decades. But things really started to come to a point, so to speak, when Forrest Anderson was elected governor in 1968. During the campaign, his major theme, as we've talked about in other programs, was about the sales tax. But in that campaign, it was about, we've got to reorganize state government. And he had an electorate that was listening to that. So when the session began in 1969, you were there, Tom, Forrest spoke in the state as the state about doing reorganization, but nothing really happened until about the 50th day, and all of a sudden House Bill 610 was introduced to create a reorganization commission and to appropriate money to fund that commission and fund the research to lead to this. And I wondered if you might reflect a little bit about the tone of the 69 session. What was it like when this subject was brought up before the legislature in those days?
Well, my recollection is that it wasn't a great surprise because people had more or less been expecting something along that line. And I felt it was brought up at the end because it was a commission and it reduced the amount of time that it was going to be debatable. Yeah. And so, you know, here's an issue that we'll appoint what we've come to call Blue Ribbon Commission. We'll appoint this Blue Ribbon Commission to study whatever. And this was executive reorganization. And the legislature over the years has had a pretty blasé time, it seems to me, with Blue Ribbon Commissions of that. They say, fine, you know, study whatever you want. And a few legislators get on it. And so it's adopted more or less, I don't want to say routinely, but almost routinely. And there's a bias in favor of it. Because it's a study, you know, we'll have time to think about it later. So with that and introduced late in the session, went through.
Well, and you know, it's good to remember that in those days, under the old Constitution, a legislature was only 60 calendar days. There wasn't 90 legislative days, 60 calendar days. And so on the 50th day, the bill was introduced, and it looks as, initially, I think it recommended 12 members. Most of whom were legislators. And I guess maybe one of the paths to getting a commission approved is have a bunch of legislators on it.
That's right.
And so it ended up, after being amended, to there were 8 members, 4 from each house, 2 from each party from each house, and the governor as chairman. So it was kind of an unusual commission in that way.
Right. They had, my recollection is that there was 4 public members to be appointed by the governor, and that tier was eliminated in the amendment process, and it ended up with 9, as you say.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. You'd kind of think that maybe the idea that the governor might have had a few extra appointments in there, and the legislature said, well, let's peel those away. And as I recall, the bill said you needed to have basically 6 of the 9 members vote in favor of any recommendation. And there are a few things that happened like that, but it did go through. The other thing that was very interesting was that the bill had in it an appropriation for state and federal money to support a staff. Do you recall much in terms of that, or was that just kind of given that you had to do that?
Well, I think it was more or less given, but it did place a contingency on it, particularly relative to the federal money. Yeah. You know, would it be coming, and when?
Yeah, I think it was. If you don't have the federal money, you can't spend the state money.
That's my recollection.
And that became relevant when we were talking about when the staff was getting hired, because they couldn't get hired until the federal money came in, and that hung out there for some time. Ironically, to think about it, the Housing and Urban Development Department had money for things like this to give to states to study modernization of their government. It's something you probably wouldn't hear of today. You know, it's kind of an interesting thing. Well, anyway, Forrest was elected. the legislature occurred. House Bill 610 came in. It was about 127. It's just, these are small numbers nowadays. $127,000 of state money and $205,000 of federal money to fund a 2-year effort with a staff that ended up being of 23 staff members. So I guess our salaries weren't that high, were they? In addition to Sheena and Diana, by the way, just in full disclosure, I was a member of that staff, and it was a wonderful experience for us. So we ended up with 9 members, and they did a study. The other interesting thing that happened was the failure of the previous efforts was because of the lobbying of the legislature by constituency groups and interest groups and bureaucrats and power and just vested interests not to do it. And Governor Anderson appeared to have discovered a methodology that Colorado used to force the reorganization, and that was to put a limit on the number of departments in the Constitution. And after the regular session occurred, he called a special session and sent that forward, a 20-department limit. I wonder if you might talk a bit about how the legislature looked at that, because that seemed to have gone fairly well.
Well, I think that the legislature, you know, it's like Mason said to Dixon, we got to draw the line someplace. So he picked 20, good enough. You know, it was an arbitrary number to some degree, but yet looked like a satisfactory number to consolidate the things, and it turned out that that was a pretty good number.
Mm-hmm. And the other outlet on it, which made it maybe reasonably easy to vote for, was that you were basically saying, we're going to put it up and let the people say they want it or not.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that was important. And the governor, we had this going on. The governor's appointees, their department heads, they had to come up with some savings just because the governor wanted this thing, and it was obvious, and yet they were on the horns of a dilemma because financially, you know, if they said, well, I can save $50,000, it's their budget that's then going to be cut $50,000. Mm-hmm. So they were caught between a rock and a hard spot, and so the numbers they came up with were all coincident with what the governor wanted, some mm-hmm. savings, and yet they were minimal savings. And the good part about that, in my opinion, was that then in the selling of it to whomever, it wasn't oversold, that this is some big savings deal. The numbers were very modest, and modest because the department heads were going to have to live with them.
Mm-hmm. You know, in the letter that the governor wrote to the legislature to say at the beginning of the special session, he wrote that Colorado had done this, but he really focused in on the bureaucrats. And I think maybe looking back on it, he was taking advantage of the fact that from a political perspective, it was a lot easier to have a little angst about bureaucrats than it was about the interest groups that they served. The interest groups included voters, but bureaucrats are always a good target. And it seemed to me that his whole thing, when he quoted that guy from Mississippi who said, I believe in this reorganization more than anything, but my commission is so unique and so distinctive that you could never take a penny away. And he put that right in the letter that he wrote to the legislature, introducing this thing, and it went through. I think I ended up finding that it went through the Senate 52-0, and it went through the House, was it 88-5. So those are big numbers, and it put it out there. And then all of a sudden, we had the amendment pending, and we had a commission formed. We were waiting for federal money, and the commission was named. And I was going to ask you to reflect upon that, and I'm going to just mention here that the governor was chairman, and Senator Tony Rozelle from Billings was elected the vice chairman. It included Luke McCune from Anaconda as a senator, Gordon Bollinger from Glasgow as a senator, both Democrats, Carl Rosted from Martinsdale, a Republican senator, and then you were put on it. on the Republican side of the House, along with Sterling Rink from Kalispell, and then John Hall and Bill Christensen were the two Democratic legislators on there. Can you reflect a little bit about the quality of that commission and who was on it?
Well, I think Bill and John had both been minority leaders in, my recollection is, consecutive sessions. And so I think that the appeal was to active, knowledgeable legislators with a field of knowledge of, has been in leadership positions. They dealt with a lot of those agencies and the public, of course. And so he was broadening the base of legislative experience on that commission, in my opinion, and I was pleased to have the opportunity to serve on it.
Yeah. Do you remember anything that Speaker Lucas said particularly to you when you were chosen? Did he give you a mission or anything, or was it?
If he did, and I don't recall that he did, and it's one of those things that I think that if we'd had a sit down with, deep thoughts, I think I would remember it. So even though a failing memory.
Well, of course, there was a broad base of support for this. I think the League of Women Voters, which was a pretty powerful group at that time. It seemed like, and they were bipartisan, or nonpartisan, however you want to say it. It seemed to me that they were big time on this issue for a decade. And they had busloads of activist women who were coming there as the League of Women Voters saying, do this, do this, do this. And it seemed like there maybe was a political tone saying, let's just not slapdash into this thing, let's do it smart and do it right. When the appointments were done and the commission met, again, pending federal money, waiting to have that happen, apparently there was a question raised. Should we do an efficiency study or should we do a structural study? And the commission opted for one of those two. Did you remember going through that a bit?
Well, it seemed to me the emphasis was on structural, and which is in keeping with the desire to carve it back to 20 titular heads of departments, and so I think it went, massively in favor of the structural over the efficient,
which made a difference. And let me just add one more thought as kind of a political animal. When the election was occurring, and by the way, at the election, it was about 70% of the people voted for the 20 department limit. And the thing we talked about was they came up with these words, 20's plenty. And they said they were able to say 161 boards, bureaus, commissions, et cetera, et cetera. We got to have less than 20 departments. 20's plenty was the decision by the commission, knowingly, I think, not to put out the commission's detailed report until after the election, so that the election was not about the details, but was about the concept. And on conceptually, 20 departments sounds really good. And so it passed so overwhelmingly. Well, all of a sudden, waiting for the federal money, the commission, I'm sure with the chairman's, was very close to the director, Duke Crowley, a mentor of all of ours, was selected to be the head, part-time, from the law school, to be the head of this. And he hired George Bosleman, a marvelous research director, to head it all up. He'd come from South Dakota and one other, Idaho, legislative council work, but he was from Columbia Falls, Montana. And all of a sudden, August came and there was some federal money and things got started. I remember I was the first staff member to come in the door other than George. And next thing you know, Diana, you showed up. A couple days later, we'd never met before. And a couple weeks later, you showed up. Sheena, tell me, Diana, as an attorney for the commission, a little bit about what your thoughts were when you walked in the door there with this job. How did you even want to have this job for this important function, and how did you get there, and what did you think about it to start with?
Well, I'm glad you told me ahead of time to reflect upon it, because I don't remember much about that at all. But when you mentioned door, I do remember my big problem the first day was finding the door, because, and I got lost for weeks up on fourth floor.
Fourth floor.
Fourth floor. I didn't know there was such a thing. And I was I've been directionally impaired for all my life. And I kept ending up in the wrong wing of the Capitol, and I couldn't find the door. But so I had to go back in my memory 45 years as to why I would even be applying for the job. I found a letter I had written to Governor Anderson in April of '69 asking for a part-time or a permanent, a permanent part-time job or just a part-time job or a full-time temporary. Okay, and the reason being I had 5 little kids at home. I had passed the bar in '65 and had my 5th child in '66. So I had 3 kids, like 3, 5, 7, 8, and 9. So I didn't want to work full time. And I think I probably heard about this job through Duke Crowley because my husband had taken Duke's place as deputy county attorney under Tom Hanrahan. And so Duke, of course, knew that there was a job available, and I don't remember interviewing or anything, but I got the job.
So you ended up walking in the door. When you walked in the door, do you have any idea what you were getting into?
No, no.
But you did most of your work as an attorney, not with George, who was directing that kind of the broader research, but with Duke on specific topics. Is that
Well, in the letter, I said I'm not asking for any kind of a job to the governor, but I think my strength is in research and legal writing. I had drafted bills for the Legislative Council for the '67 session and the '69 session. And so, boy, and both Duke and George were great researchers, great writers, and I just learned a lot from them,
And Sheena, when you came in the door, I remember it well.
I was so young, Evan. And straight off the farm. In fact, I didn't start.
Literally?
Literally straight off the farm. I don't think I started until the first week in October because harvest was late, and so I wasn't allowed to leave the farm. In fact, I'm not sure my dad was too pleased that I was coming to work for a Democratic governor anyway. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, so he kept me around. But it was, it was a great, exciting time.
You had just come out of finished the university, right?
Just graduated from the University of Montana with a degree in political science, shiny, brand new degree, and here I was coming to Helena to do the real thing. I mean, it was pretty amazing, and in the governor's office of all places, in Montana's capital. I mean, it was really exciting, but pretty scary too. I mean, I remember being, oh my goodness, what did I get myself into here, and how did this happen to little old me from little old Dutton? So.
Well, as difficult as it is to try to understand the structure of Montana government, even as it exists today, think of the confusion we walked in on.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody knew. This chart we just looked at didn't exist.
Yeah.
We didn't, any of us know, so yeah, it looked like a pretty daunting task, didn't it?
Well, and as it turned out, I mean, some of these little agencies, you'd go and, I remember doing some of the smaller ones, and it was like, these people don't have any idea how they fit in the big picture. Their vision is totally restricted to the walls within they work. And a lot of them were working very hard, but they just had no overall sense of their place in state government as a unit. So it was.
There maybe was no particular place.
Right.
That was that was the point.
Yeah.
Now you worked mostly under George as opposed to Duke. Duke was one level up, and so he'd come over from the law school, and everything could be packaged up for him to look at and work. He worked very closely with George, but you didn't work with Duke that closely, did you?
No, but I do have a. I think Duke was. I met a few Butte guys in college.
Yeah.
So, but I think Duke was the first real Butte guy I knew, and looking back on it, he kind of set the tone for every other Butte guy ever dealt with. And
he came out of Dublin Gulch.
He was, this farm girl recognized a city guy. He was, for Montana, he was a city guy. And I remember him saying, where the pavement stops, Crowley stops.
Yeah.
He wasn't going camping.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So, but he was. I
And
remember
George.
And George was the best boss anybody could have, and especially a brand new, young, naive, coming to town for the first time. He was patient and a great mentor. He, taught us. He was, as I say, just so patient. He was kind and quiet, but very funny, very, very smart. I mean, he set the tone by leading by example. He worked harder than anybody, and so you were compelled to keep up with him or not let him down. I mean, he was that kind of a guy. You just didn't want to let him down, so you felt like you had to work hard to.
And Diana, your reflections on working with Duke,
Well,
mostly? Was he
of course,
kind
he's
to
the
you in your
legend.
research? Yeah. Was he kind and tender with you in your research?
No, I remember presenting my first report, and Duke is reading it, and he'd go, ah, ah. Why don't you just say it, Diana? But I knew Duke and his reputation beforehand. Stories of Room 35, and he was a member of my husband's Gout and Garbage Society, and they would meet and fix meals every month and stuff like that. But he was a great teacher. Of course, he was a teacher, a law school professor, and I learned so much. I think my entire career stemmed from what I learned from Duke Crowley.
I always thought that the years I spent working with Duke, I'd tell my three brothers who were lawyers, I'd say, I got my law degree from Duke Crowley without having to go to law school. And really, I learned so much that way.
Yeah.
Tell me, about Diane, about any particular areas of research that kind of stick out in your mind of things that you did and that you were able to bring to the fore.
Well, one of my first assignments was state investments, and I think that's one of the biggest things Executive Reorganization did. And now that Sheena's now on the Board of Investments, it's just amazing.
Yeah, but it's small
Because
circle,
I remember, reading the law and the Constitution about how state investments were supposed to be handled. I didn't even know what an investment meant, probably. I remember going to the treasurer's office, expecting to find a big vault with the state treasury cash stacked up inside this vault. And anyway, I found out that the land commissioners, the state treasurer, the depository board, all those people that were supposed to be in charge of investing state monies weren't. And there were 17 agencies doing investing. There were hundreds of probably agencies out there just depositing their funds into banks around the state at no interest. At any rate, after the long report and the investigation, Duke Crowley gave George Bauselman entire credit for developing the idea for a state board of investments. And now we have one. And at the end of '72, there was about $300 million in state funds invested. And now Sheena tells me there's $16 billion invested in state funds. So I learned a lot.
Did you get a finder's fee for that? Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, the investments was one, but you found some things when you were looking at motor vehicles, for example. You found, it's hard for us to believe what I think you discovered in those days, what was going on over there.
Well, and that was going on throughout state government, as Tom mentioned before. Data processing, word processing was just beginning. Okay, the registrar's office in Deer Lodge, the warden was the state registrar. I guess because
they made license
plates were made over
plates,
there.
Yeah.
So, and the law required that he use prison inmates for clerical help. That warden at the time didn't believed that prisoners belonged in the permanent records of the registrar's office, so he wasn't using any as clerical help. But there were 68 employees there, and they were processing millions of documents, all by hand, hand typed, hand stapled, hand sorted, hand filed. They were getting something like 3,000 documents a day to file under under license plate numbers. So they were always way behind. The counties were way behind in filing the documents with the registrar. There were 18 employees that did nothing but check the documents that came from the counties, and there were 8 employees that spent full time sending back those documents for corrections.
So while you were looking at structural aspects, the obvious efficiency things jumped out.
Had nothing
and it
to do
ended
with
up being some of the arguments for doing it, I suppose. Did you remember having much interface with the commission itself? Did you go and help do reports to the commission, or did they leave that pretty much to Duke and George to do?
Well, I went to the Historical Society after you said we were going to have this and read all of the commission minutes. And I was present at some of those meetings, but I don't remember a thing about it.
I think we all had learned the lesson that this was at a higher political level. This was legislators who were, my gosh, legislators, and they had decision-making authority, and there was a guy there named Duke Crowley and a guy named George who could talk to him much better than we could. And I think we all kind of shrunk away from that. I certainly felt that way myself. Now, Sheena, in your department, you got into some big departments and stuff, and some interesting stuff. Could you give some reflections on some of those?
For whatever reason, I ended up with the natural resource agencies. And the idea that came out of that was that they would all be combined, and which would make the Fish and Game Commission just a part of another department. And I think looking back,
oh, that sounds like fighting words.
Definitely fighting words. And, for a rather naive young student, basically, to take on Frank Dunkel, who at the time was the Fish and Game department, and it was his department and his commission, and they were very, very jealous of their independence from anybody, much less the governor. So it was a challenge. I was not Woodward and Bernstein by any stretch, so digging into Fish and Game was a big challenge for somebody. So he was a charming guy who was, just, he would walk up to you and give you a little red rose to put on your collar. So, I mean, he was just very, it was easy, it was hard to be tough-nosed with Frank Dunkel. And in the end, the department, I think, pretty logically, it had a very clear mission. It had a very conscientious group of stakeholders. It had its own money. So, I mean, I wasn't really surprised to see it end up being its own department. Yeah.
Now he, by the way, for historical context, he ended up at loggerheads with Forrest Anderson so badly that he left and he ran for governor in 1972.
I think still with the little red roses.
And he ran in the Republican primary, and Big Ed Smith beat him in the Republican primary. And that was then, I think he went to Denver, and it's the last time he surfaced politically in Montana. But he was a pretty powerful force.
Very
now,
powerful.
how did he contrast with your other agencies?
Well, the natural resources at the time included the Department of State Lands, not the investment side of it, but the managing the lands part of it. And Ted Schwinton was the head of Department of State Lands. And Ted immediately understood the whole notion of why executive reorganization was necessary. He believed in it. He understood that it was going to be quite a process, but he was so helpful. And he was a farmer. My dad was a farmer. I grew up on a farm, so I have a much easier time with conversations with Ted, and he became a lifelong friend. But the important thing, he wasn't threatened or challenged by it personally. He understood that this was for the good of everyone, and he wanted to be a part of doing that. So,
and maybe another thing is that I think Frank Dunkel was appointed by the commission, the Fish and Game Commission,
right.
had its own authority.
Right.
And Ted Schwinden was appointed by the land board, but really he was a governor's appointee.
Right.
So he was right in tune with what Forrest Anderson wanted to do. And in our discussions with Ted, he reflects on that quite a bit.
Yeah.
He understood it for sure. Did you get a chance to interface with the commission much, or?
No, I don't. Well, if I did, I don't remember. I'm like Diane.
We were all buried, our heads
Yeah.
were buried in the work, weren't they?
Right,
It was an amazing amount of work that had to be done. Actually, when you look at this book right here, which is the report that was given to the legislature in December of 1970, and that's a pretty thick document. Not one that every legislator would read every paragraph of, but this is about maybe 1/20th of the volume of the stacked up volumes of research that back this up with report after report after report after report. I always remember how disciplined George was. We referred to him as SAPs, S-A-P. S-A-P meant that when you did all the research and you wrote up all the information, then you had a summary, you had an appraisal, and you had a proposal. And that was the substance of this, was everyone looked at the summary, appraisal, proposal, but backing it up was all this wonderful data. And backing it up was the sword of Damocles hanging over the head of everyone once November of 1970 came and the people voted 70% to limit to 20 departments.
Every county.
Yeah, every county in the state of
Yep,
Montana
every
voted
county.
in favor of it. So all of a sudden it's like, well, this is going to happen. Now, it could have happened in as late as 73. And we're going to talk about the 71 legislature a little bit here in a second. I want to just quickly mention from a staff perspective that there were 23 staff, if you count Duke as part-timer. There was a part-time director, a deputy director, George, administrative assistant, that ended up being me, 4 attorneys, 10 research analysts, and 6 clerical assistants. 23 people doing that work and crunching it out in that much time. And it was only about 12 months, 14 months of work. I mean, what an amazing...
Yeah, I don't know how George did it. It was magic.
pretty amazing to get it done. So then it ended up, and again, through the legislature, 161 good reasons to go 20's plenty, and it passes overwhelmingly. So what do we have? We go to the 71 session. In the 71 session, Tom, you had been elevated. You became the majority leader of the House. And I think you got to be the lead sponsor of, what was it called, House Bill 3?
House Bill 3?
Which was basically
Basically that
like
converted
that
into a bill.
yeah. And that was a terrific thing to read and try to do. But how did the legislature approach, in your recollection, getting such a massive undertaking properly reviewed by a legislative body? You know, it had to be a big challenge.
Well, I think it has to be viewed in legislative process viewfinder, because the legislature, as you know, works on a committee basis, and so the standard procedure is a bill, particularly a complicated bill, goes to a committee, and that committee then does the evaluation in as much detail as they want to. But the other legislators are really on the periphery, and structurally that legislature works with the result of the committee being almost like it's good enough for me, just because there isn't time for everybody to get in on the hearings and do everything. There's just such a volume of work. So it boils down to time constraints, and so a few people end up doing the oral work, the hard work on any piece of legislation, and the others just say, you know, we have to be bound by that.
And in this case, since these individual committees of jurisdiction, you would have had to break the bill up into 20 different committees. A special committee was formed, and they were held joint hearings. Was that
That's my recollection, yes. And then I think that the governor, in his letter that you referred to, focused the antagonists as being the department heads. So he really kind of focused, and of course then when you get into the antagonistic part of it, they basically all worked for him, you know. So I think he tempered opposition at that time. And there was not opposition, but concern about this. This was a massive change. And so everybody was a little concerned about what it was doing. Was it going too far? You know, does it favor the Democrats? Well, there'll be a Republican governor tomorrow. There'll be a Democrat the day after that. So that kind of took the fluff out of that opposition. And then my recollection is Senator DeZevi, a Democrat.
He was the floor leader, the majority leader of the Democrats in the Senate.
In the Senate. And then Representative Mather from Billings took on the skeptical role. Will it do this? Will it do that? And appeared to almost be not opponents, but concerned about the details. And that lasted, you know, for almost till near the end of the consideration of the bill, and as to my recollection. But the overwhelming nature of support, that 20's plenty, really did have a ring to it, to everybody. And then, so you get near the end, and both of those individuals, those legislators, had statewide political ambitions. One ran for governor, the other one ran for Congress. And so, you know, they could see the handwriting on the wall. So all, really, basically, all opposition to it was dissolved and disappeared by the time it was over.
You know, during that time, you know, I had been administrative assistant to the commission, on the commission staff. And I was, in 1971, 25 years old. And I didn't know anything about the legislature, but I must have been a good soldier or something, or or fearless or something. And I got pulled off the reorganization staff and put on the direct governor's staff because they wanted me to help them to work the legislature. And they didn't think it was not appropriate to have a member of the reorganization staff go work the legislature and lobby the legislature. So I went to the governor's staff to do that. And of course, I knew nothing about lobbying the legislature. I was the eyes and ears and legs and hands for people like Duke, people like Gordon Bennett, people like Fred Barrett, who'd been brought in to be a special legislative assistant at the time, to help Ron Richards, who was the executive assistant of Forrest, to help all this happen. And what I recall was almost a circus-like atmosphere, a carnival-like atmosphere in what was a series of 6 gigantic nighttime hearings in the House chamber that Representative Mather chaired, and DeZevi was, and the senators came over too, and in 6 nights, one after another of every one of these major things came up, and frankly, 90% of the testimony was in opposition. It was in opposition by people who either were in departments and said, oh, you can't do this, or they were the constituent group saying, we're too sacrosanct, you can't do that, or in the case of, it's our money, it's not your money that's being spent, and a lot of that type of stuff. And so the preponderance of the testimony was in opposition. And clearly, the legislators seem to have found a way to look beyond that. And maybe it just reinforced the message that, as Forrest said at one time, we got to get all the nuts in one cage, you know. And I wonder what your reflections on those big hearings. Do you remember those?
Well, I think that the opposition, the opponents that you mentioned, were mainly the smaller so-called departments, the smaller of the almost 200 groups. And if we reflect back on how they were originally came into being, you know, if you had a little turf, you did this, you were on the massage board, then the concern was that people are given haircuts don't start giving neck massages. And it's that kind of actually it's turf. They say, well, and they come to the legislature and get a very receptive response from the legislature. They say, well, we want to be professional, so we want to have this board, that board, and then we'll subject ourselves to licensing and some regulation. But what it's all about really is they're carving out their piece of turf and they want to be protected. So it's two things. They want their turf and they want to keep other people out of their turf. So many of those, if not most of those, come into being that way, and the legislature over the years has said, fine, you can have your own deal and run your own show. But
Pretty soon
at
you
a
got
time-
200 of them.
I mean,
Yeah.
right, it grows like topsy, and pretty soon you have to come to grips with it and say, listen, this ain't working.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is kind of interesting. Diana?
I had dibbies on telling this story about the opposition. I read about one hearing where Representative Ralph Peck from Deer Lodge testified on behalf of the Funeral Directors Association, and he said, on behalf of the Funeral Directors Association, I want to tell you that we will gladly bury this bill for nothing.
I remember that. I remember that, absolutely. Well, the one thing when we think about it, I think all those small boards actually were the linchpin for the support, because they were sometimes the barber board suggested that you only have 19 departments and we have one staff person, but our function is so important we should be the 20th department. So when things like that are being laid out to the legislature, they start to see the sense in the whole thing. I did the research, by the way, on the occupational licensing boards. When I first went to work there, that's the first research I did. Well, what an eye-opener for me. And out of that, I developed what I audaciously call the Barrett's Law of Public Administration. And I took claim to it, but I've never seen it violated since, which is that you learn that the smaller one's area of authority is, the more jealously they guard it. And so it's the little guys were jealously guarding every inch of their turf, to the point that legislators looked at it and said, what? You know, come on now. And with the sword of Damocles hanging over it, of course. Now, House Bill 3 was introduced. That was the bill you introduced. And the senators got nervous about it. And so later on, with Senator Luke McCune, one of the members of the commission, put out a bill called Senate Bill 274. It was an exact mirror image bill. You can't do that today, but you could back then. And that bill got moved across and eventually became the bill that passed as Senate Bill 274, which became the chapter laws of the thing. And those hearings were really kind of interesting. Now, there was discussion, Tom, at that time about delaying it all until 2003, because under the constitutional amendment it said you have to have these 20 departments in place by 2003.
19.
Or excuse me, what am I saying, 2003? 1973. So here we were in 71, and the idea was to pass a law by July of that year, and there was some effort to push it back 2 years. What was your sense of the mentality of, because there were some in the legislature that wanted to do that because some of the constituency groups were making noise, and the comfort level issue. Maybe that's why it took so long for it to come together. Your thoughts, recollections?
Well, it just seemed to me that that was almost a fallback position of the people that had effectively lost their effort to either stop it or derail it. And so then, well, the next thing is to delay it. And I think it was just received like that for the majority. And the other thing, when you get into something like that, and then you get the fallback positions, the majority almost always overcomes that. But the good thing about that, legislatively and politically, is that then it gives some cover to the people that represent those that were, hidebound against it. They can say, well, I tried my best to delay it where we could think about it and then maybe repeal it later. And so it gives legislative cover for those people that want it and need it, think they need it, but the majority rules, and and you know, you don't want to say they get steamrolled, but that's the basic
Well,
line. They get overdone.
And like you said, a lot of the legislators were depending upon and looking to the leadership of DeZevi and Mathers. And once they kind of said, okay, let's get this done.
Right. They collapsed on that, and the thing was a dead issue then. It was going.
Now, contextually, it's important to note that this was the 1971 session. So while this was a huge, huge bill for the future of Montana, remember the big battle was the sales tax, which is the subject of a lot of additional programming and discussions on in the Crucible of Change because of how important that was politically for decades. And Speaker Lucas and you know, we had the '67 sales tax with Speaker Felt, and then '69 it was, they kind of didn't do it, but in '71 that was the biggest, hottest thing. So as important as reorganization was, it was not the hottest political thing. The
Right.
sales tax was. So this wasn't like this was the only thing the legislature was looking at. Now, when you look at it, when it was all said and done, this is the bill that passed. Senate Bill 274 created 19 departments, and that's how it looked. Now, that's a big contrast to the look of the previous chart. And I think that one would have to say mission accomplished. And it's an interesting, Sheena, you might reflect upon, since you just came off being the chief of staff of the most recent governor, deputy chief of staff of the most recent governor, how close is that to today's government?
Well, and I actually went and looked at the new chart that's in the state phone book, and it's down to 16 departments. And we still have lots of agencies that are attached for administrative purposes, but it makes sense. And it's not a static process by any means. It continues over the years, changes here, there. Some big ones, some smaller ones. Governor Schweitzer, and I think maybe with the help of the legislature, we got rid of
Whacked off a few more.
a couple dozen, I think,
Yeah.
a couple dozen boards, commissions, councils, whatever, some just advisory, some not. And so it's an ongoing process, and I think this process that set it in stone in the Constitution was so important to keeping it going and keeping us within these guardrails.
Yeah.
Or
I almost think there was a stroke of political genius, strategic political genius, the way that all came together. And I don't know you never know who's the author of genius. It's usually a committee. But nonetheless, that did, and looking at it today, I always say 80% of today's state government is the same
Yep.
as it was created
Yep.
back then, which meant the job was done rather well. I want to ask you each this a little bit as we get ready to wrap up. Your reflections on what this meant to you as a young person, and then how it helped shape you a bit.
well, I had this little degree in political science, and it all of a sudden made a lot more sense. And it stood me in great stead, this training that I got via this process, and with George, learning leadership style from George, how to do it right, made a big difference to me going forward. And I stuck with government pretty much my entire career, except for a little wayward step into the restaurant business.
Well, you can't help yourself if you want to run a restaurant,
Right, yeah.
you know.
Yeah. But it set the tone for the rest of my career.
Well, you've
And
had a rather distinguished and varied career, and just with what I learned from this stuff, I could see how it held you in good stead
Yeah,
and set
yeah.
you off very well. Diana, how about you? What are your reflections looking back on it after all these years, and what it maybe meant to you?
Only because you asked, I would have said, well, it was just one of my first jobs, but that job, because George had come from legislative councils, Governor Schwinden loved legislative
He'd
councils.
been on the legislative
Yeah.
council, yeah.
And I ended up, every job I think was a result of that. I ended up working for the Legislative Council some 20 years, always involved in legal writing, recodification, et cetera, and ended up Governor Schwinden appointing me gambling queen. First director of the lottery, anyway.
Well,
But that's how Duke Crowley remembered me.
yeah. Well, really, you had a very distinguished career in state government, working for the legislature in a broad way, not a partisan way. And it looked to me like this experience was really important for you, and
Absolutely.
you know.
It drove the path of my whole career.
Well, Tom, yourself, your reflections on this, the big picture of this, and what it meant to you, and what do you feel about it as an accomplishment?
Well, I really feel good about it as an accomplishment. I think it's just what you've portrayed, that it really set the standard, and I suspect will continue to be the example for government in Montana, and similar to other states that have done the same thing, and others certainly followed us. That's no question about it. I think as far as the excitement of it, you can't just look at this but realize that we were going through a new constitution, adoption of a new constitution, and everything that went with that. We, at virtually the same time, we had come off the United States Supreme Court decision on representation, one man, one vote.
Yeah.
We had gone through reapportionment, had gone to single-member districts. So there was just, you know, it was almost a revolution occurring in Montana government, although it was at an evolutionary pace. So it was very exciting to be in the legislature and to be a part of it. There's just no question about it. I think I reflect back because superimposed, which we mentioned earlier, was the fact that computers were just coming into their own. You know, we'd come from automatic typewriters to word processors to System 6, going into computers. And so that was all new too, and superimposing that on the efficiencies that resulted from this, even though it was a structural effort. I mean, great savings, just many things that a person can be proud of being a part of.
Well, the title of this series is In the Crucible of Change, and what you just described was, look what was right in there at the same time. All the heat, all the pressure to accomplish massive changes in the executive branch of government, new constitutional law. There was an empowerment of people in this, in essence. It was on the ballot. They were saying, we want to do A, we want to do B, we want to get it done. I mean, what a kind of an amazing period. That's why we're looking at it. And of course, that's why I'm so happy you guys, all three of you, were able to join us today. I mean, if you think about I look back in my life and say, probably the single most impactful job that I ever had was this one, when I went to work for this commission. One, because I was so naive and knew so little and walked away knowing an awful lot. I got a chance to go to school on real things, not book learning. And then I got to work in the political arena of making things happen. And it was in that political arena, in that crucible of change, all that heat was occurring. It was really on account of what the people were demanding. People were demanding their government do better for them. You know, that's an interesting insight given where we are today and some of the attitudes that we hear about government today. In any case, Tom Harrison, thank you so much for coming down and joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and Diana, it's always great to be back with you. And
What?
It's always great to be back with you. And Sheena, we've spent many years together,
We have.
but it's great to be together here today. Thank you, and that's it for this version of In the Crucible of Change.